It wasn't not a girl. Continuation. Do you remember the story of my friend? Well, let me tell you that she returned to school after 4 days of absence. During that time, her phone remained silent, no calls answered, not a single message read. Worried, we tried everything to get news. It wasn't normal for her to disappear like that, not after what we had seen. On the 3rd day without news, we decided that someone had to go to her house. The one who lived closest was chosen. She hesitated a lot before accepting. We didn't blame her. We were still trembling at the memory of that video, that impossible smile. But in the end, she did it for me. That afternoon, walked to the house where lived, an old 2-story house with a terrace and a worn-out, aged by time. She looked up at the 3rd-floor terrace, where she had often seen and her grandmother watering plants or hanging clothes to dry in the sunlight and wind. Everything looked the same, but something in the air felt different. Gathering courage, she rang the doorbell. She waited, no response. She pressed the button again, this time for longer. Nothing. The unease turned into a knot in her stomach. She looked at the front door and decided to try that. She knocked with her knuckles, first softly, then harder. Silence. She turned around, thinking of leaving. That's when she heard the sound of a lock turning, making her stop. The door opened just a few centimeters, and a man's face appeared. He was middle-aged, with weathered skin and a tired gaze. Had never seen him before, but he must have been the tenant from the 1st floor. "What do you need?" the man asked in a low voice. Swallowed hard. "Good afternoon, excuse me, I'm looking for, or her grandmother, Mrs. We haven't heard from them and we're worried." The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze softened with an expression of sorrow, and he sighed before replying. "Grandma got sick. They had to take her to the emergency room. I suppose has been with her this whole time." Felt a shiver run down her spine. Something about the man's voice unsettled her. It wasn't just sadness, but a kind of resignation, or maybe fear. Is she okay? But the image of that thing crawling in the darkness of her house, smiling with its impossible mouth, wouldn't leave me alone. I said nothing more. I just nodded. The next few hours passed in strange normalcy. Went back home with her family, and continued with their routines. I tried to do the same. I tried to convince myself that it was all over, but it wasn't over. That night, something changed. I woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. The room was steeped in darkness and my mother was still asleep beside me, but something was wrong. I knew it the moment I felt the air. Cold, dense. As if it didn't belong in that room. That was when I heard it. A faint rustling. A scraping sound against the wood. It came from the hallway, just on the other side of the door. I held my breath. I didn't want to move, I didn't want to look. But then the sound changed. It became faster, as if something was moving toward the door. No, not moving, crawling. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I shut my eyes, gripping the blanket as if it could protect me. A loud thud against the door. I shuddered. Silence stretched on. And then a laugh. Soft, muffled, as if it came from a torn throat. A laugh I already knew. I didn't open my eyes, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And in the last second, just before everything turned dark again, I heard it once more. My name, whispered into the nothingness. "Do you know what happened to her?" asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," the man replied, and without another word, he closed the door. Stood there, an empty feeling in her chest. Something wasn't right. She returned home with her heart pounding. The man's response hadn't reassured her, it had only made her more anxious. She had no certainty about what was really happening. Where was it true that her grandmother was sick? Why wasn't she answering messages or calls? As soon as she got to her room, she grabbed her phone and sent a voice note to our WhatsApp group. Her voice trembled slightly as she told us what had happened. And I listened in silence, sharing the same feeling of helplessness. We were left in absolute uncertainty. We had no other options. We didn't know which hospital Mrs. was in, and no one at's house seemed available. All we could do was wait, but that only made our anxiety worse. The next day, the atmosphere at school was heavy. And I met in our classroom before the first class. We spoke in hushed voices, careful not to be overheard. It was hard to focus on anything else. Everything felt surreal. It was difficult to accept that just a few days ago, we had been in's house, facing something that logic and reality itself. The sound of the classroom door opening startled us. The class director walked in and we all returned to our seats. Trigonometry dragged on, slow and confusing. My mind wandered. I couldn't help but remember that horrifying image, the impossible smile, the grayish skin, and those deep, empty eyes. I shivered at the thought of what we had witnessed. Had thought it was a little girl, but it wasn't. And the worst part was that we didn't know what it really wanted. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Professor stopped the lesson and went to open it. My stomach clenched when I saw her. Her expression was calm, too calm. She looked exactly the same as always, yet something about her felt off. The teacher briefly scolded her for arriving late, but she just nodded and walked to her seat, sitting under everyone's watchful eyes. I quickly took out my phone and hid it under my notebook cover. I sent a quick message to the group. "What happened? Are you okay? And your grandmother?" Within seconds, the chat filled with messages from Anne. We all wanted answers, but she only responded with a phrase that left us even more uneasy. "I'll tell you everything at recess. Don't worry." I glanced at her as she put away her phone and pretended to pay attention to the teacher. But something in her distant gaze told me that her mind was somewhere else. When recess arrived, we left together and surrounded her as soon as she stepped out of the classroom. Took her arm, silently showing support. We walked to our usual spot, the small green area of the school. There, among the sound of the wind and buzzing insects, we could talk without being interrupted. We sat in a circle, waiting. Took a deep breath and sighed before beginning her story. She told us that after we left that night, she waited for her mother to come home from work. When she arrived, she gathered her and her grandmother in her room and told them everything. She left nothing out, not a single detail. From the first time she saw the girl in the living room to that disturbing night when we all saw her clearly. She waited for her family's reaction with her heart pounding. To her surprise, her mother wasn't skeptical. In her eyes, there was a mix of fear and understanding, but Mrs. reacted completely differently. "You must leave everything in God's hands," was all she said, her tone firm yet serene. "Those things are portals. By watching horror movies with your friends, you opened a door you shouldn't have." Stared at her in disbelief. She turned to her mother, hoping for a different response, and found it in her understanding gaze. But her grandmother said nothing more. She stood up and left the room, but not before reminding her granddaughter that she should pray to drive away whatever she had brought. When they were alone, dared to ask, "Do you believe me?" The mother nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered, "because I have seen her too." Felt the air escape from her lungs. Her mother told her that for weeks, she had been waking up in the middle of the night with a strange sense of fear. She felt watched, as if something was lurking in the darkness. Then the knocking on the window began. Soft, insistent knocks, taps made with nails, like the ones had heard that night after leaving the bathroom. However, she had never gathered the courage to look. Deep down, something told her that ignoring it was the best choice. "The mistake was paying attention, my child," she told, her voice trembling. "That's what we did wrong. You shouldn't have looked for her. We shouldn't have feared her. You shouldn't have tried to capture her on video." We remained silent after pause. I dared to speak in the middle of that silence and asked her what had happened to Mrs., her grandmother. She glanced at me sideways before focusing her gaze ahead again. She told us that on that same night, as she stared at the ceiling of her room in complete darkness, her mind drifted into a whirlwind of thoughts and the recent guilt her grandmother had planted in her heart, for trying to record that thing, for trying to seek it out, for fearing it. Suddenly, a horrible noise shattered the silence. It was an agonizing sound, the noise of someone drowning, like a person whose lungs refused to respond. Didn't think, she just reacted. She ran out of her room toward the source of the sound, her grandmother's bedroom. But she couldn't get in. Something was stopping her. The door handle wasn't locked, she could turn it, but still, she couldn't open it. It was as if a heavy structure on the other side was blocking the way. At that moment, her mother arrived, and upon realizing what was happening, she pounded on the door with all her strength, first with her fists, then with her shoulder, then with her feet. Suddenly, the door burst open, sending both of them tumbling to the floor. They quickly got up and saw Mrs. on the bed, her eyes wide in terror, her mouth completely open, desperately trying to breathe, her skin turning a bluish purple. No air was entering her body. She writhed back and forth, one hand gripping her own throat, squeezing tightly. Her screams were muffled, as if she were choking, as if something was strangling her. His mother rushed to her, trying to pull her hand away from her own throat, but Mrs. had an inhuman strength. Desperate, she ordered to call emergency services, dialed with trembling fingers while her mother struggled with her grandmother. At some point, she dropped the phone and hurried to help. Together, with all the strength they had, they managed to pry Mrs.'s hand away from her neck. In that instant, the old woman inhaled all the air in the world, with a rough, desperate sound, a painful, dry, and deep gasp. She coughed violently for minutes before collapsing unconscious on the bed. Watched her, a glass of water shaking in her hand. Her mind couldn't process what had just happened. How could a woman nearing 70 have more strength than both her daughter and granddaughter combined? How could she have been choking herself like that? Or was it something else? When the paramedics arrived, they immediately placed Mrs. in the ambulance, got in with her while her mother took a taxi and followed closely behind. It was 3 in the morning when they reached the nearest hospital. Given her medical history of hypertension and respiratory problems, she was admitted as a priority. Once stabilized, the doctors called Sm's mother to ask some questions, and one of them left her frozen. What caused the marks around Mrs.'s neck? Sm's mother collapsed to the ground in tears. She had no answer. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain what had happened? How could she say that her own mother had been suffocating herself as if something was forcing her to do it? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Told us that she didn't want to leave her mother alone in the hospital, but her mother insisted she go home and resume her routine. The situation was affecting her too much, and staying there wouldn't help anyone. She had spent the past few days going back and forth between the hospital and home, taking quick showers and gathering clothes for her mother and grandmother. We didn't know what to say. I could only reach for her hands and give them a warm squeeze, one that conveyed my understanding and support. We all shared the same thought, though none of us dared to say it out loud. What was that damned thing? Why did it seem so attached to and her family? Time flew by, and the bell rang, signaling another 4 hours of class. We stood up and walked to the classroom in complete silence. It felt like a funeral march. That was the atmosphere all of this had left us with. And then, amid the crowd of students entering their classrooms, a chill ran down my spine. I turned my head slightly, and in the reflection of the hallway window, I saw something that made me freeze in place. A deformed, small figure with an impossible smile and eyes sunken into darkness was watching us from afar. I swallowed hard and quickened my pace. No, it couldn't be. It had to be my imagination. Yes, that was it. That day ended with an even darker atmosphere than before. Rushed home to prepare a few things before heading to the hospital. We wished her luck and watched her leave without saying much more. On the way to catch our transportation, we all walked in a deafening silence, as if words were unnecessary or even dangerous. But I couldn't stay quiet. I hesitated for a moment, wondering whether to tell them what I had seen among the crowd of students. That twisted face, a sickly gray, staring at me through the sea of people. But I didn't want to add more weight to everything that was happening. Instead, I asked what we should do. In a serious and solemn tone, said the only thing we could really do: support, be there for her. There was nothing else in our power. It was true, but that didn't take away our sense of helplessness. Each of us took our bus and went home. Around 8 p.m., I was sitting on the living room couch, absent-mindedly watching some show, when a notification from our WhatsApp group snapped me out of my daze. It was. She had sent an audio message. I played it immediately. Silence. A dull, white noise, as if the microphone was open in a room where the very air held something hidden. The recording lasted over a minute, but not a single word was spoken. Notifications from and arrived soon after, asking what was going on, if everything was okay, but wasn't responding. Something wasn't right. I called her immediately. It rang once, twice, until finally she answered. "Is here," whispered. A chill ran down my spine. What are you talking about?" "The thing is here with me." Explained, her voice shaky, that she hadn't stayed at the hospital because her mother wouldn't allow it. She had classes the next day and didn't want her to get too caught up in everything, but her mother hadn't considered what was hiding in their own home. "The girl is here," she murmured. I shuddered. Had gone to the kitchen to serve herself a plate of food when she suddenly heard heavy footsteps on the terrace, as if something was running with too much force, with too much weight. Fear paralyzed her for an instant. Then, without thinking, she ran back to her room, leaving her dinner untouched and the door open. "Close the door," I told her, my heart pounding in my throat. "You can't leave it open," but sobbed on the other end of the line. I can't move." I was asking her to do the impossible. Something I don't even know if I could have done in her place. She took a deep breath, got up, trembling, and slowly walked toward the door. I stayed on the phone, whispering that she could do it, that it was just a door. But I was scared too. I could feel it climbing up my chest like a cold knock. Made it halfway across the room, and then she saw it. At first, she thought it was the girl. The same girl she had seen in the living room days ago. But no, it wasn't the girl. It was something else, something worse. Let out a strangled gasp. It was a creature on all fours, completely black, with tangled, matted hair dripping as if it were wet. Its skin seemed to tear apart with every movement. And there it was, that damned smile, growing wider and wider as if it wanted to rip its face open to its ears. And those eyes, almost completely white, locked onto. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She just stood there, frozen, as if staying still enough could make her invisible. She watched as the creature advanced with inhuman movements, its limbs twisting as if they didn't belong to its body, as if it was falling apart with each step. It passed right in front of her, turned slightly, and suddenly it bolted up the stairs toward the terrace. I don't know how much time passed where all I could hear was ragged, uneven breathing. I was paralyzed on my end of the call too, until I screamed. I screamed with all my might, feeling my throat burn as I tried to snap her out of that trance. Picked up the phone and whispered, "I don't want to be here, I need to leave." I told her to take a taxi, to go to my house or we would pay whatever it cost. As we spoke, I was already messaging the girls, and we all agreed, had to get out of there. His house was the closest option. "Don't hang up," I told her. "Stay on the line with me." We didn't hang up for even a second, not until arrived safe and sound at its house. But that fear, that feeling that something else had followed her in the darkness, still hadn't let go of us. We said our goodbyes with a strange sensation, as if the calm was nothing more than a fragile mirage about to shatter. Looked better, with more color in her face, and tried to keep the mood light with a joke or two, but I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. Something didn't fit. Something hadn't left. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing. The grotesque smile, the hollow eyes, the gray, decaying skin. It wasn't a memory, it was a present. As if, somehow, I had brought something with me, as if in the shadows of my room, something else was breathing. I decided to go to my mother's room, seeking comfort in her steady breathing. But even there, the air felt heavy, as if we weren't alone. The next day passed without major incidents. Let us know when her mother called to tell her that her grandmother had been discharged, and they were just waiting for authorization to leave the hospital. And congratulated her and felt relieved. I should have felt that way too, but something inside me refused to share that feeling. I couldn't stop thinking about that house. Not until that thing was gone. But how does something like that leak? How do you face something that isn't human? "Everything's going to be okay," told me, holding my shoulders. Her expression was firm, almost convincing. "My father is staying with us for a few weeks. If anything happens, he'll be there." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that her father's presence would make a difference.